Okay, there we go. Thank you. Um, Field training is the most intense part of your Air Force training. If you're like me, it will be the single thing you remember most about your entire ROTC experience. You want to be successful at field training. My job here today is to help you succeed by sharing 5 important lessons I learned when I went to field training years ago. And to emphasize this, here I am leaning out of my KC-135, holding up 5 fingers to remind you to pay attention to what I'm saying about the 5 lessons I'll be describing. Next slide, please. Excellent. I want to thank Colonel Grimm and Major Gilbert for inviting me to speak to you this morning. Before I begin, though, let me give you briefly a little background on me so you know where I'm coming from. I was a 30-year Air Force officer, and like all of you, I got my commission through UC Berkeley or through ROTC. I was at UC Berkeley. I was in the class of 1977. After getting commissioned, I became a KC-135 and KC-10 pilot, went through pilot training, of course. And then as I got more senior, I had some headquarters assignments as well, including Strategic Air Command, U.S. Atlantic Command, European Command, and my last assignment was at the U.S. Embassy at Brussels, Belgium, where I was the chief of the Office of Defense Cooperation. After retiring from the Air Force in 2007, I came to San Diego, where I became a software development program manager. This was a radical change from what I had been doing before at a large tech company here in San Diego. And then in 2015, I went part-time with the company so that I could focus more on my writing. And in 2019, I published a book called Aimpoint, an Air Force Pilot's Lessons for Navigating Life. And this last year, I started a series of writing retreats called Make Your Book a Reality, aimed at first-time authors to create their own books. Next slide, please. So here are the lessons I'm going to be sharing with you. And yes, 1975 was a really long time ago. None of you were alive. Your parents were probably small children if they were even around. And Gerald Ford was president, or maybe it was Herbert Hoover, I forget. The 5 lessons I learned not only helped me through field training, they also helped me succeed throughout my Air Force career and beyond. I will be going through each of them in more detail. And if there's time, I invite you to ask me questions at the end about the briefing or anything else I talk about. Next slide, please. Don't fight the system. Lesson number 1. There are 3 learning objectives for you at field training. To learn about the Air Force to make your transition to active duty easier after you get commissioned, to learn to function as a team, and to become confident in yourself by graduating from this rigorous training program. You'll also be evaluated as your potential for being a future officer. Keep in mind that this is an artificial construct filled with strict rules and standards, and it's all designed to teach organization and discipline to you. You'll be thrown into a situation with 24 strangers and you'll have to adapt. You won't have time to learn everything or do everything perfectly. Despite that, you're going to need to move forward every step of the way. There are times that you're going to be frustrated at yourself, at your teammates, and at the Air Force. And you're going to wonder, why are there all these meaningless make work tasks? My advice to you is to get over it. Don't waste your time or energy pushing back. And the reason I bring this up was that there were 25 cadets in my flight when I started field training. Only 23 of us graduated. There was 1 cadet who had to leave because of personal reasons. And it was my understanding that they were looking at putting him into a class later in the summer. But there was one cadet that could not get over what was happening at field training. He focused on all of the different things he had to do, and he allowed it to frustrate him to the point where he did a self-initiated elimination and he left the program a couple of weeks in. Don't project your field training experience into what active duty life will be like. Your life as an Air Force officer will be very different than field training. As an officer, you'll be evaluated on how you perform your job and not on whether you fold your underwear properly or you have droplets of water in your sink in the morning. The lesson I learned at field training was that this was not the place to fight the system. The more you resent and push back, the bigger hole you dig for yourself. You don't want to do that, obviously. There will be time during your career, especially as you become more senior, when the Air Force will rely on you to make positive changes to the system. Field training is not that place. Next slide, please. Lesson 2, plan ahead. My primary focus as a 20-year-old cadet in 1975 was to prepare for and then go through graduate from field training. That summer, I also wanted to make money so that I could pay for my college living expenses. So I came up with this brilliant plan. I was going to go to the earliest field training session possible. And then once I got back, I would work at the local fruit cannery, which actually paid fairly well, for the rest of the summer, and I would earn money that way. Well, I requested it from the Air Force, and they granted my request and assigned me to field training at Rickenbacker Air Force Base in Ohio, and it started 2 days after my last final exam. So clearly I couldn't drive there, but the Air Force did give me $600 to buy an airline ticket to fly. And so I went to a local travel agent. This is how we did it back in 1975. I went to a local travel agent and asked her to show me the cheapest way I could fly to Columbus, Ohio, and I could arrive just in time in the morning training started. And so we worked on a ticket, and it was brilliant. It was an overnight flight, and I would sleep on the plane. There were 3 legs involved, 3 different airlines, minimum turn times at all the connecting airports. And I would arrive just in time to catch the bus to the base to start training. And what could possibly go wrong with this? Clearly, I didn't think about what happened if I didn't make it on time, or what shape I would be in when I got there. Now, as fate would have it, the angels were looking out for me that day, which is a good thing if you're an Air Force pilot, because I made it. I made it. All the flights connected, and my luggage even made it, which is a small miracle unto itself. But I didn't plan ahead as to what condition I would be in when I got to training. So there I was after having slept on the plane and not shaven, and I didn't look like I was ready to start field training, which was on me. It's completely self-inflicted. So as we got off the bus, we were hustled into a large room, and there was the commander of the field training, Colonel Mangles. That was his name, Colonel Mangles. And Colonel Mangles told us what he expected from all of us. And he talked about what we're going to be doing and how he expected us to be disciplined and professional. And in the middle of his speech, he stopped and he pointed to me in the front row and said, "That cadet needs a shave, and he looks like he slept in his shirt." And he was right. I did need a shave, and I did look like I slept in my shirt. This was hugely embarrassing. There were other officers in the room at the time, but I didn't know who they were. You know, they were staff, cadre staff. So after that embarrassing briefing, we all divided up into flights, and there was one classroom for the flight that I was in, and that was C flight, Charlie flight. And that's where we met our commander, Captain Wilmot. Captain Wilmot told us about himself, started by telling us about himself. And he told us that his hero in life was Woody Hayes. For those of you who don't know, which probably is everyone, Woody Hayes was the national champion football coach from Ohio State. He is also famous for coining the phrase, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And he had huge anger management issues too. He got fired a few years later for striking a football player. That's this guy's hero. He also told us that when he was an ROTC cadet, he didn't win honor flight. And honor flight, you'll find, or if they still have the same system, one of the flights, there were 8 flights at our camp. One of the flights will be judged honor flight based on accrued points throughout the entire camp. And evidently, Captain Wilmot, when he was a cadet, did not win honor flight, and it bugged him for the rest of his life, to that point at least. He wanted to be sure that we didn't regret our experience to win honor flight by not winning it. And his definition of that was that we needed to be number 1 every week, not just overall, but in all categories. And there were academics, there was drill, there was inspection, and there were sports too. So we had to be number 1 in everything all the time. I can say with near certainty that there were 0% of us that wanted this, that we could care less about being honor flight. We didn't want Woody Hayes as our flight commander. We wanted someone more like Tom Hanks, America's dad, who'd treat us nicely. But we had what we had. So as Captain Wilmot paced in front of us, telling us how miserable our life was going to be, every once in a while he would stop and he would look at me. Didn't say anything, but this was not in a good way. I was clearly off to a bad start at field training, and it was entirely my fault. The lesson here for everyone, the lesson I learned for all of you as well, is think and plan ahead. Look at what could happen and look at what the next step is once you complete your plan as well. Now, don't get me wrong, we can do very complex tasks in the Air Force, but as a general rule, it's important to keep things simple and understandable whenever we can. For example, if you're coming up with a plan, like I did, that involves the sequential completion of 4 unlikely events, or if it requires divine intervention to be a success, you should probably reconsider your plan. Next slide, please. Be decisive. So we're still on the first day, by the way. Be decisive. After Captain Wilmot's briefing, he posted the duty schedule, and I happened to be the first cadet duty officer of the entire camp. And the cadet duty officer was someone for the entire camp that performed this task. This sounds impressive, but it's not. It's not a high honor. Basically, I was supposed to answer phones and take messages and things of that nature. I would much rather have been with my flight that afternoon going through our first courses or whatever we were doing as part of field training, but there I was. I had an assistant. There was an assistant duty officer, and he was from our flight as well. We left after our meeting. We went to the duty room, and there we met the officer in charge, who was another flight commander. His in briefing to us was basically showing us the checklist binder full of checklists that he said answered any questions we have. And then he told us he's going to be back in a few hours, and he left. So there we were, answering phones, taking messages. About 30 minutes into our shift, we heard sirens going off outside the room we were in. We didn't know what we were. I think the other guy was from California like me and weren't familiar with what sirens meant. What does that mean? Shortly after the sirens went off, the door opened to the duty room, and a random cadet poked his head in and said, "That's a tornado warning," and then left. So there we kind of had an indication what that might actually mean. We didn't really know what to do. So So we went to the binder, the all-knowing binder, and we looked through it, and there was a checklist for tornado warning. And the first line in the checklist was stop training activities and seek shelter. So we were debating about, between the assistant and I, what to do about the tornado warnings that were going off. And here's this checklist, and we can't find the officer in charge. No cell phones at that time, of course. And so we wondered for a bit, but in the back of my mind, I knew something that had happened the year previous. And this was a national news event where a huge half-mile wide tornado touched down in Xenia, Ohio, which was near where we were in Columbus. And it went through the center of town. It killed or injured 1,000 people and was hugely destructive, fatal for a lot of folks. And so I looked at, well, what if we do shut down training? What if we don't? And the consequences of not shutting down training, if in fact a tornado touches down, were so great, I decided that we were going to shut down training. And so I keyed the microphone, made an announcement over the loudspeaker, and told everyone to stop activities, seek shelter, and send flight representatives to the duty office for further instructions. And so right after I did that, I heard a lot of noise outside the hallway as people were coming back in and sheltering in the hallway. Over the next few minutes, different cadets from each of the flights came in, and I gave them further instructions about shutting windows and doing head counts, things like that. Then about 10 minutes after I had made the announcement, the Commandant of Cadets, Lieutenant Colonel Moran, came to the office, and right behind him was Captain Wilmot. And as he opened the door, he announced, "Who is responsible for shutting down training?" And what I figure happened is that once I made the earlier announcement, he asked around, seeing which of the officers directed me to shut down training. And in fact, he discovered that no one had directed me to shut down training, that the cadet duty officer had decided on his own to shut down field training. So we were standing at attention, and as he's talking to us, the Commandant of Cadets, the assistant duty officer turned his head and looked right at me. And clearly he did not want to have anything to do with this. And I don't blame him. I didn't want to have anything to do with this, but there we were. So I spoke up and said, "It was me, sir." And I gave him the reasons why I did this, and I showed him the checklist. Colonel Moran looked at the checklist, and then he looked back at me. And then he looked at the checklist again. Then he shut the checklist, handed it back to me, and said, "Carry on." And he turned around and left. And Captain Wilmot turned around and left with him. And that might have been, I think I saw a smile. It might have been the only time Captain Wilmot smiled during the entire training experience. The end result was that no tornadoes ever touched down in the area. But what if they had? The cost for inaction, however remote the chance, was so severe, I couldn't wait for permission to make the announcement, so he did it. As officers, you will be faced with many decisions in your career. It's always wise to consult your boss, get advice, gather more information to make the best decision you can. But there are times when you simply have to decide what to do. Don't delay your decision waiting for the perfect solution from yourself or those who work for you. Don't be afraid. Just make a decision and go with it. Next slide, please. Do the best you can, always. Of course, the number one reason for doing the best you can is because you're Air Force officers. We're all Air Force officers. Our core values are integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. It's who we are. Your fellow airmen and our country always expect you to do your very best, period. That's the reason. Now, I will also tell you that it's also important to always do your best because you never know who's watching you. Shortly after my tornado adventure, Captain Wilmot made me the cadet flight leader, meaning I was the designated leader for sea flight. During the week I was the designated leader, we ended up as the #1 overall flight. Field training after that went well. We graduated. I will say though that the focus all along from my detachment back home in Berkeley was completely on graduation. If we did anything above that, it was commendable. They encouraged it, but it was not the requirement. When I started back up in the fall, I found that I had gotten a #1 rating from field training, which put me in the top 10% of the cadets at camp. I was pleased with that, of course, but I didn't see it as having a big impact because I was just the same as all of my other classmates who had graduated from field training. We were in the POC. Well, what happened was that in the spring of 1976, the Air Force did something very dramatic. They had a reduction in force board. And what they were reducing were cadets with pilot training slots. This was a result of the post-Vietnam budget drawdown, and they had too many pilot candidates for the amount of training that they had going forward. So they held a board, and there were 1,000 of us nationwide who had pilot slots, and they rank ordered us from 1 to 1,000, and they took away the pilot slots from the bottom 70%. So 700 cadets lost their pilot slots. This was traumatic for everybody. In my case, my roommate lost his pilot slot while I kept mine. And the biggest difference between me and 90% of the cadets that were competing was my ranking from field training. This ranking made another difference too. Eventually, I became the cadet group commander. That's a picture of me at a dining out in the spring of 1977. And it affected my entire career, of course, because if I had not kept my pilot slot, my career arc would have been completely different. This also taught me to always do my best. Never know who might be watching and where that might lead. This is true for all of us. Next slide, please. Don't be quick to judge people. You're going to be thrown into a group of 25 cadets. This is your flight. And you will immediately start assessing everyone else once you meet them. This is completely normal. It's healthy. It's a defense mechanism that's built into us. And it's completely understandable. What I'm asking you is to be open to reassess, and this is not just for field training, but especially at field training because it's such a dramatic experience. Be open to reassessing your initial opinions after you get to know people. In the picture on the left is Captain Wilmot. He is pictured in one of his more jovial moods during training. My experience with him is a great example of this. When we all first met him, we figured he was a complete jerk who didn't care about us at all. He just cared about us winning honor flight, which we thought was for his benefit, a big feather in his cap. While he never became best buddies with any of us, nor did we expect that, we discovered over time that he really wanted us to succeed, both as individuals and as a team. He also gave me some wonderful advice. First one ever to give me this advice. One day at training, he pulled me aside and said, being a good pilot is important, but to succeed as a pilot doesn't mean becoming the very best pilot in the squadron. It means becoming the very best leader. And this is true for any career field. You can talk about navigator, maintenance, what have you. Being the best doesn't mean becoming the very best technically, although you need to be good technically. It means becoming the very best leader. Another time, and this was when I was the cadet leader, the flight leader rather, he came by our dormitory after dinner and asked to meet with me as we were getting ready for the next day, one-on-one meeting. So he did. He wanted to talk about that one cadet I mentioned earlier that was having difficulties. So he and I shared our thoughts. I gave him some advice, and then he left. I was very impressed that he would come by and seek out my opinion. This taught me the importance of getting feedback from the people I lead so that I can make the best decision possible. The last thing I want to touch on was that after field training, I learned that Captain Wilmot's last assignment had been as a military advisor to the South Vietnamese Air Force, and this was 1974. And in that role, he had to have lived with his associates from the South Vietnamese Air Force, made friends with them, got to know them well. You bond in that type of assignment. In May 1975, just 1 month before our field training, the North Vietnamese Army overran South Vietnam. For the South Vietnamese military members, some of them did manage to escape, went to refugee camps in Thailand, some even came to America. But the vast majority were either killed outright or went to brutal re-education camps. This had just happened, and then training started. This had to be playing on Captain Wilmot's mind. This had to be something that he was present with, and who knows how that affected him. Ultimately, I was mistaken about Captain Wilmot. He cared much more than he showed initially in that horrible briefing. The bigger lesson here is that you will be working with a whole lot of people in the Air Force. Some of them may have personal or family issues they're dealing with to the point where it affects their attitude. I'm asking you to be open to finding out what's behind their attitude and to see if you can help in any way. You'll be surprised by what a positive response you get just by asking the question and listening. And who knows, you might be able to help as well. Next slide, please. So I want to finish up by telling all of you how awesome you are. Thank you, every one of you, for volunteering to serve your country as an Air Force officer. Be proud of yourself. Look how far you've come already. You're sophomores, you're getting ready to go to field training. By the end of the summer, you'll have field training complete. I want to be the first to congratulate you in advance of your arrival in the POC. You're almost there. And I invite you to look ahead eagerly to the amazing adventures you're going to have, not only at field training, but also and especially as an active duty Air Force officer. It's okay to get excited about this. Thank you all. Thanks for your time. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them about anything, not just what I talked about. And here's my contact info. If any of you want to contact me about anything, I would be happy to make contact and talk with you about anything Air Force or book writing, if you want to write a book. That may come later, who knows? Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir, for giving us that wisdom about field training. It's awesome to hear from a distinguished graduate who went to field training. So does anybody have any questions for Colonel Hurd?
I heard all of you giving constructive criticism before. If you want to give me constructive criticism, that would be great. Don't be intimidated. which that statement in itself intimidates people.
Colonel Hurd, may I make a statement?
Yeah, sure, of course.
So I thought that it was really interesting the way that you briefed it. It very much reflected, like, I think your experience in writing your book and like your experience as a writer, and also reflected a lot of, or really clearly illustrated what you learned through your time at field training.
Thank you. That's Cadet Kuiper, right? Thank you very much.
Yes.
I appreciate that.
Colonel Hurd, may I make a statement?
Yeah, certainly, of course.
I liked your presentation a lot, and I think it was very helpful. I do have a question for you though, sir. I was wondering what motivated you the most growing up to become a pilot?
Oh, thank you. Good question. My father was a pilot in World War II, and he actually flew C-47s, C-46s in New Guinea and then over in Europe during the war. So, but after the war, he wasn't on active duty. I did not grow up as an Air Force child. He was in the reserves for a good while, and we went to Travis Air Force Base on occasion for his reserve duty. But he always represented, and we admired our father a lot, but he always represented something very positive in our lives. And I decided, it actually, and I write about this in my book, not that that means anything, but I had a choice between a Navy and Air Force scholarship. I applied to both of them, and the Air Force was the only one that would promise, and until 1976 board, but promised me to be a pilot. The Navy didn't offer ROTC scholarships for that, although that possibility was there, of course. What really changed my mind was that when and this is kind of another lesson, was that when I went to Cal Berkeley, I had two options, and I decided, and my dad went with me, decided that we would go there and we would visit the Air Force people and visit the Navy people and back then they were in the same building, the two ROTC detachments. And it could not have been more night and day. The Navy people, we showed up there first, and they could have cared less. They basically told me to come back next week when things start and we'll tell you more then. And the Air Force people were extraordinarily welcoming and made me feel like they wanted me to be a part of the Air Force team. And it was just incredible. And I was kind of leaning towards the Navy, actually, because my father had been very successful in the Air Force, and I just didn't want to have that direct comparison. He ended up being a brigadier general. So it's like, do I want to join something that Dad was in, and we all admire him and we love him, but I don't necessarily want to be, well, how are you doing compared to your dad? So I was leaning towards the Navy, but after that experience, it's like, oh, forget it. I want to go someplace where I want to go. And they did offer me a pilot slot, and I loved it. I know that there's a lot more options. Back in 1970s, to be eligible for really the prime assignments throughout our career, you really had to be rated. And typically that meant pilot, and that's why I aim for that. But there's a lot more options now. I know I'm talking to both Air Force and Space Force here as well. And as I got more senior in the Air Force, I dealt with a lot of Space Force who would become Space Force colleagues. Just a wonderful group, and that's exciting as well. There's a lot of exciting opportunities, but I wanted to be a pilot largely because my dad was. So thanks for asking.
Colonel Hurd, may I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
So, you were talking about how you possibly lost your pilot slot.
Yeah.
Did you at the time know what you were going to do if you didn't achieve that?
That's a really good question. All these are really good questions. Thank you. I knew that I wanted to be in the Air Force. At that point, I knew that I wanted to continue. And that one of the options was, if we lost pilot slots, there would be an option to continue on and go into another career field. So so I did want to still be an Air Force officer, very much so. So leaving ROTC was not an option. Although some of my compadres did. They left. They decided to leave the Air Force because they weren't going to become pilots. Tough question, I guess. On some level, I did think about it, and there were other good options. I know my roommate, who lost his pilot slot, became a maintenance officer. He loved it, and yay maintenance. Wonderful people. As a squadron commander and a group commander, I had maintainers who worked for me, and those men and women were just fantastic. So that would have been an excellent option, but I didn't really consider it as much because I think the natural ability to deny that this might happen. It was one of those, if it happens, then I'll cross that bridge when I come to it. But I wanted to focus on just doing the best I can and hoping that I would keep my pilot slot. And they also, and I'm sure this was deliberate, they didn't give us much notice. They kind of told us that the board happened and that we'll find out next week. So there wasn't a lot of lead time between us knowing that this was going on and us finding out where we stood. So good question. But to wrap up, there are lots of good options. Another friend of mine who lost his pilot slot from our detachment, he went into intelligence and he loved it. There's so many exciting things to do in the Air Force, and that's a huge reason. In fact, I'm kind of getting off track here, but I'm here. I got the floor. I didn't intend to make the Air Force a career when I started. I was going to, kind of like my dad did, I was going to fly and do the very best I could and enjoy myself. And then I was going to go to the airlines or something else. I wasn't sure, but I expected to be in for my pilot training commitment and do well and then do something else. And what I found was that I was just having the best time. I loved the mission I was doing. I loved being an Air Force officer. I loved being an Air Force pilot. Most of all, though, I think the biggest reason was that I really enjoyed the people I worked with. What a fantastic group. It's just motivating, encouraging, people you can trust and enjoy and appreciate. And it was just a fantastic experience. And things were going well for me. And one opportunity led to another and fantastic assignments. At one point, as a colonel, they sent me to the Defense Language Institute to learn French so that I could speak to my counterparts, my Belgian counterparts, as I worked at the embassy. What an outstanding experience. And that was all possible because I stayed in the Air Force. So yeah, it was a very enlivening experience. I'm sure this comes across, but I really enjoyed it. And I'd like to believe that regardless of what I did in the Air Force, I would have enjoyed it as well. It was just such a wonderful experience. So thank you. Anything else?
Great. Well, that's the end of class. But if you do have any other questions, please, you can stay behind for about 4 minutes. And then I do have to go to another class. But yeah, if you just want to stay behind, go ahead. Otherwise, you're dismissed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such a pleasure to be here. I'll be here and we'll hopefully talk another time. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel Hurd. Have a good
Yes.
day.
Thank you, Col Hurd.
Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Colonel Hurd, do you have time for a question right now?
I sure do. Thank you.
So my question is, in lesson number 1, you emphasized not getting caught up on the small details, not fighting the system. I was wondering if you could offer any specific tips or maybe psychological, just kind of methods in doing that, in getting through it and not fighting the system.
Excellent question. Thank you. So the best advice I can give you is kind of like the duck. Let the water roll off your back. Just do what they tell you to do. Don't fight it. Don't push back. Don't say, "Oh my God, this is so stupid. If I did it this way, it would be so much better." Or why do they make me hang my pants over a hanger in this very specific fashion, and then I get demerits if I in fact don't do it that way. What, this sounds ridiculous, and it kind of is, in the sense that, you know, when you go on active duty, you're not going to be dealing with that. Obviously, your personal life's your personal life. But the fact of the matter is that the cadre wants you to do that so that it forces you to become organized and disciplined in how you do things. That's a part of the training. It's important. What I would suggest is to adopt rather the attitude that, you know, these tasks, this thing is for training. This is for our field training purposes. It's nothing other than that. I mean, take it seriously, do what you're asked to do, but don't get wrapped up in the injustice of it all, or how silly it is, or the fact that you got a demerit over something that was really stupid and you shouldn't have gotten that ding on your record. Not that it's on your record anyway. When you graduate, who cares? So just let it go. Let it go. Good question though. That's really good.
Yes, sir. Water off your back. Thank you.
You bet. Thank you.
Sir, I had another question.
Yeah.
It's kind of off the topic of field training. Do we have time for the question, Major Gilbert?
I do. Well, I do, but
Yes, so I made him co-host, so I just have
Oh.
to drop out in 1 minute, but you can.
Okay, then I will be a little late to the AS100 class. Okay, thank you, ma'am. My next question, I was just wondering what your take on the future of the remotely piloted aircraft would be, if you think it's I mean, coming from like an ex-pilot standpoint.
the what again? I'm sorry.
The remotely piloted aircraft, the drones.
Oh, you know, that's fascinating. I think because casualties, and I'm just going to give you the big picture stuff. And I went to war college and all this stuff, and the U.S. public, very understandably and for very good reasons, is really sensitive to casualties, and we don't want them, obviously. And you can send remotely piloted aircraft into areas that are dangerous. And if they get shot down or lost for whatever reason, then you haven't actually lost a life or lives associated with that. So there's an attractiveness to that. And typically to this point, most of the RPVs have been larger reconnaissance or remotely attack. They'll send a missile that hits a target that, not fighter, not tactical aircraft, but so I think there's a benefit to having them from a national security perspective. There's a benefit to having them. I think to a large degree, there are some airframes that don't really lend themselves to remotely piloted operation right now. And specifically from a tactical perspective, I think there are advantages to having pilots in the cockpit who can make decisions based on what they're seeing happening in real time. And it's tough to do that with a remotely piloted vehicle because they're, even as fast as they are, you need someone who's taken a look at it, who can process things from their picture, from their perspective rather, and decide what to do in the situation. Whereas a remotely piloted vehicle, as sophisticated as it is, still can't do that type of thing, and we need that. There's transport aircraft, tanker aircraft to a large degree. I think it's a little difficult to do those remotely piloted, but at the same time, you kind of wonder, why would you want to do those necessarily? Because they're standoff aircraft. You don't need them over the combat area for real-time reconnaissance, flying 24-hour missions. You just don't need that. Whereas for RPVs performing those type of missions, that's useful. That's useful where you can just fly them up there and you can look at it from monitors on the ground. No lives are at risk, and they can loiter for just forever and provide information, and even launch weapons if they see something that pops up. But there's still a need for piloted vehicles as well. And as technology progresses, who knows, I may change my opinion, but for right now, that's where I see it going.
That's a great answer. Thank you, sir. I only asked because I've been on a little bit of a binge, just researching and looking at a bunch of RPA stuff. So I think it's really interesting, and it seems like that's where the future is headed. So
that's absolutely correct. Your assessment is right. It is very interesting, and that element is a significant portion of the Air Force is headed very understandably, and from a national security perspective, it's where we need to go. We can't be too wedded to the romantic image of the pilot with the scarf and hair blowing in the wind, or whatever the case might be.
yes, surely. Thank you, sir.
You bet. You bet.
Thank you for your time, sir.
Oh, you bet. Thank you. No, it was great. Great talking with you guys, and hopefully we get a chance to do it again. Good luck. Good luck at field training. You'll do
Yes, sir.
wonderfully. That's really the message. You'll do
Thank you,
great.
sir.
Just don't get wrapped up in the details.
Thank you, sir. Have a
All
great
right.
day.
Take care, guys. Good talking with you. Bye now.